We have a rare opportunity to have a wonderful presentation from Professor William Casto. I'll talk about him in just a second, but I couldn't help but pause and enjoy and just share, for those who did not see, a week ago, the Wall Street Journal had a headline that said, "Justice Department chiefs can't get enough of the patron saint of the rule of law." And I'll quote this from Sadie Gurman, July 13th, 2019. "He had barely been sworn in as Attorney General when William Barr told Rod Rosenstein he had dibs on one of the Justice Department's prized assets that was in his deputy's office. 'Rod, I don't want to take it now, but I want you to know I'm going to take it that once you are gone,' Mr. Barr said. The coveted item? The official portrait of Robert H. Jackson, whose government service from the New Deal era through World War II and beyond included powerful roles: Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, and of course, Chief United States Prosecutor at Nuremberg. Mr. Rosenstein often looked to Justice Jackson as a source of inspiration. In fact, at Rod Rosenstein's farewell celebration earlier this year, a friend joked that he invoked Justice Jackson only 5.2 times every hour. The Antitrust Division, which he was the general counsel for a period of time, recently renamed its room 3125 in his honor. It's slowly becoming a shrine, in addition to the Robert Jackson Center, the other shrine, said Macon Delaran. At the Justice Department, he's left an imprint and a trajectory that people really latch onto. In fact, Professor John Barrett has written about that quite extensively in his Jackson list. He saw the complexities and spoke about them eloquently. The thing that often is referred to when you go on Google News Alert and you type in Robert H. Jackson, you'll see a thing called a letter he called the Federal Prosecutor. The Federal Prosecutor was delivered in April of 1940 and spoke of the duties of the prosecutors and their need to be free of partisanship. The citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. That has become the guiding star for U.S. attorneys and is quoted over and over and over again. In fact, and used in the Justice Department. Recently, we hosted here Donald Verrilli, who was the Solicitor General under President Obama, and he talked extensively about that and the fact that he, as Solicitor General, which is one step below the Attorney General, ultimately went and grabbed that portrait, the prized portrait of the patron saint, and whether you're Democrat or Republican, they all kind of lay claim to this, and made a copy so he could have it in his office. So I'm so thrilled, as just the Wall Street Journal gave me a perfect opportunity to lay a little bit of information of a one-year period of time of Justice Robert H. Jackson as the 57th Attorney General, and to have a man of such esteem like William Casto come and join us and share his book entitled Advising the President, Robert H. Jackson and Franklin D. Roosevelt, and its subtitle or its applicability today. Professor Casto earned his law degree from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and a Doctor of Science of Law degree from Columbia University. He joined the Texas Tech faculty in 1983 after practicing law for a number of years. He's written a number of well-received books and articles on international law, international tort law, and on the federal courts. He's particularly interested in the United States Supreme Court and is frequently cited and relied upon his published scholarship. In fact, he was telling us just the other day the number of times that the United States Supreme Court has quoted him in their opinions, which has got to be just a heady experience. So without any further ado, I am thrilled and honored to introduce Professor William Casto.
Okay, let's have a good time this afternoon. I'm not much on speeches, but I love chatting with my students, and I suppose you all are my students this afternoon. there will not be a test afterwards. You know, some time ago, in the last century, I was playing in the Library of Congress Manuscripts Division. That's what historians do for fun, right? By the way, the library would be a lot more fun if they had beer on tap, but they don't. Is that the obligatory introductory joke? I guess it is. Hey, I came across an essay that Robert Jackson wrote, but was never published. And it was a really extensive essay on how he went about helping Franklin Roosevelt arrange for the sale of 50 old destroyers to the British when the British were standing alone against the Nazi Colossus. A few years later, now I Xeroxed the whole file, right? A few years later, an enormous controversy arose after 9/11 over legal advice given to President Bush II on the legality of torture. And I listened to all the arguments and the statements, and it struck me that it was all about politics and not about principles or the law. And I thought back, I'm going to study Robert Jackson, not as a justice or a judge, but rather as an advisor to the president. And notice this, the incidents we'll chat about today took place in 1940. Do you see that no one remembers the political controversies there? No one really cares about it. Oh, it was controversial. Should we help Great Britain in its fight against the Nazis? That was controversial. I don't think it's controversial today, right? So by studying Jackson, you see you can factor politics out of your analysis and just have the process itself. And so I decided to write a book on Jackson. It took me about 10 years because, I just love doing this sort of thing. And I figured I need to find out everything there was to know about the United States in 1940 when the events happened. Now, Jackson, of course, you've had sort of an introduction to Jackson. His friends called him Bob. He was raised in Jamestown, just a few miles from here. His father was a well-to-do but not a wealthy farmer. And Jackson grew up sort of in the countryside. When you read his life as a kid, it was like a pastoral idyll of, ice skating, horseback riding. He loved horses. His father raised horses. He loved horseback riding, swimming, hiking, you name it. It was just a great time. The only apparent blemish was that his father drank a little too much, okay? Apparently not enough to cause serious problems. Now, Bob was born in 1892 across the state line in Pennsylvania. And he grew up outside on a farm outside of Jamestown. He never went to college. All he had was a high school degree. He did attend law school for 1 year, but he didn't receive his degree because of a technicality. He did, however, after graduating from high school, 2 high school teachers that he loved gave him a year of post-high school liberal arts education. He was an astonishingly knowledgeable and gifted writer. So he sort of interned or clerked with a lawyer and then became a lawyer when he was 21. By the early 20s, he was about 30 years old, in his early 30s, and he had become an enormously successful lawyer in Jamestown. Now, he was an immensely optimistic fellow. When he was 59, he remembered back to growing up and his first 3 or 4 decades, and he remembered it with great fondness. He said, "Our world then was a peaceful world. It was, I assure you, a very comfortable era in which life might be hard but not hopeless, in which we might contemplate struggle but never defeat. We were," and then he quotes Robert Browning, "the years in the spring, the days in the morn, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world." So he's a very optimistic, very open fellow, at least open as a public persona. The Great Depression came along and it didn't bother him. I mean, he didn't like the Great Depression, but in his mind, it confirmed his utter faith in America and our political processes. When we experience economic disaster, along came Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, elected by the people through our constitutional process, and he delivered us from the Great Depression. Roosevelt and Jackson were both New Yorkers, right? Jackson had sort of a nodding acquaintance, a nodding respect for Jackson, but Jackson was very close and highly respected by 2 of Roosevelt's friends, Henry Morgenthau, who became Secretary of the Treasury, and James Farley, who was one of Roosevelt's key advisors. In 1934, Jackson came to Washington and was appointed chief general counsel of what is today the IRS. From then, he had a meteoric rise. I wonder, should it be a meteoric rise or fall? I'm not certain of that, because meteors don't quite rise, do they? Oh, well, we're going to say he had a meteoric rise. And he became sort of a political polymath. He did everything in the Roosevelt administration. He drafted speeches for the president. He went on the hustings campaigning for the president. He organized political conventions, and he was a general idea man for the president on top of all of his legal work. Now, in addition, he became one of the president's most trusted advisors. He was trusted because Jackson always told the president what he thought should be done, what he thought should not be done. And at the same time, the president always knew that it was very clear that Jackson was very loyal to the president. Frequently, when he would tell the president, "This is not a good idea, you shouldn't do it," well, sometimes the president would say, "No, I'm going to do it." Frequently, it turned out Jackson was right, and Roosevelt highly regarded him for that. Now, in 1940, he became Attorney General, was the president's chief law officer. And he frequently advised the president on legal matters, but you know what? You can't really understand the relationship between the 2 men unless you understood Jackson's personal relationship with Roosevelt. He viewed Roosevelt as, quote, "my hero, friend, and leader." And he was very sincere and honest when he said that, "my hero, friend, and leader." At the same time, whoa, don't worry about it. At the same time, Although I'm going to miss a quote here. It doesn't matter. At the same time, President Roosevelt was not terribly big on following the law. Jackson himself said, the president had a tendency, President Roosevelt, to think in terms of what is right and what is wrong instead of legal and illegal. Because he thought his motives, Roosevelt's motives, were always good for the things he wanted, he found difficulty in thinking that there were legal limitations to them, which, by the way, makes things interesting for a legal advisor, right? Now, Jackson's basic approach to advising the president was, first, he would tell Roosevelt what his chances were on a particular legal issue and what his risk was. Do you see that simply involves advising the president, saying, here's what the law is, here's what might happen. I think we have a good argument, but, he would literally give the president his best view on what the law was, what the president's chances were, what his risks were. Then, by the way, that's just advising. After the president made a decision was the second step, then Jackson, in his words, would support the president as best I could. And I think it's very important to bear in mind those two concepts. First, we advise the president, then the president makes his or her decision, right? After the president has made a decision, then you support, at least in Jackson's mind, support the president as best you can. Now, today I want us to enjoy talking about 4 episodes, okay? I also want us to learn some ethical or moral views of what was going on in this relationship. So we're going to have fun and hopefully enlighten ourselves. Gosh, I think that has something to do with Chautauqua, doesn't it? So we're going to talk about 4 examples. One example is the construction of, and this sounds exciting, the construction of the District of Columbia's National, now Reagan Airport. Then we're going to talk about the problem of pervasive illegal wiretapping under the Roosevelt administration. Then we're going to talk about something called the Destroyers for Bases deal, which sparked my initial interest in Jackson's career. Finally, we're going to look at the creation of what they called the FBI, quote, suicide squad, end quote. Now, let's talk first about the National Airport. In 1938, at this time Jackson was Solicitor General, but was pinch hitting for the Attorney General on helping the President. The Washington Airport was a joke. It was literally a pasture, a farm pasture, with a road through it. When planes wanted to land at our national airport, flagmen would run out and flag down cars. The plane would land, and then they'd let the cars continue driving. We clearly needed a national airport, but the whole problem was snarled up in a crazy patchwork quilt of local politics and the like. By the way, Congress had appropriated money to federal agencies. Money was sitting in the Treasury, but Congress had not allowed for the expenditure of those funds on a national airport. Well, Jackson was at a cabinet meeting, cabinet meeting, and in Jackson's word, the president was pretty much disgusted. And then the president turned to Jackson and says, I want you to get with the agencies and knock their heads together until you get that money knocked out of them. By the way, no one thinks that Franklin Roosevelt was a brilliant intellect, right? But everyone agrees that he was a brilliant leader, and he was willing to be quite decisive when the occasion arose. Well, Jackson knocked the money out, and the construction commenced immediately. Unfortunately, this activity was blatantly unlawful. There's just no dispute. Under the Constitution, no money is allowed to be expended unless Congress has authorized the expenditure. And in this case, Congress had not authorized the expenditure. Jackson knew it was unlawful, but notice he made the president's illegal plan happen. By the way, he advised the president, you know, Mr. President, this is illegal. Under the Constitution, we can't do it. But the president had decided, I'm doing it anyway. And the president was in a jocular mood on a telephone call. He said, hey, am I going to go to jail as a result of this? And Jackson said, I told him all I could promise was to go to jail with him. He was a very witty guy. Now, notice in this National Airport, by the way, who really cares about the National Airport? We're glad it's there, but it's hardly significant. But notice this, there are two steps in this process. The first step is, I need to tell you what the law is. I need to advise you, Mr. President, on what the law is. Jackson did that accurately. He said, this is unlawful, okay? The next step was the president decided, I don't care, I'm going to do it. And Jackson then took action to support the president's illegal plan. Now, notice, how should we judge Jackson's complicity in the president's illegal plan? Do you see you can't use law to judge whether it's okay to violate the law? You have to turn to some other concept, right? Like ethical or moral values. Jackson turned to ethical concepts to justify his complicity in the president's illegal plan. He said the action invaded no private right and took nobody's property. It was a no harm, no foul situation. It's true that the action clearly impinged upon Congress's right to determine the expenditure of funds, right? But President Roosevelt had checked with Congress, and informally they said, we don't care if you do this or not. The president did it. It was immediately apparent that construction had committed, but Congress never objected. In addition, another non-legal ethical concept that Jackson used to justify this situation was that, hey, if the president hadn't done this in 1938, we would not have had a modern airport to support the United States during World War II. By the way, did you notice the issue I'm talking about is sort of present today? When President Trump wants to build his wall, do you see that he's not allowed to build the wall under the Constitution unless Congress has approved it? I don't know, it's hard to, you can't distinguish these two cases legally, but notice with Roosevelt knew that Congress didn't really object and took the action, and Congress never objected. Do you see in the case of the wall, Congress knows all about it, they carefully considered it, and they decided no money for that wall, or a limited amount of money for that wall. I suppose that's a way of distinguishing the two cases. Hey, I want to talk about illegal wiretapping now. This is our second episode, okay? In 1940, when Jackson took over as Attorney General, the federal government was wiretapping our citizens without restraint. The Justice Department and the FBI was doing it. In Jackson's word, the investigative staff, the Alcohol Tax Unit, the Narcotic Law investigators, the postal inspectors, the Secret Service, everyone was doing it. Likewise, the intelligence departments of the Army and Navy were tapping wires with no apparent restraint. All this was done without a warrant or without judicial supervision, because at that time the U.S. Constitution did not bar wiretapping at all. So at that time, if a government official wanted to wiretap your phone, the official just did it, okay? Now, these widespread intrusions were unlawful under an act of Congress, the Communications Act of 1934. And the Supreme Court had twice held that this act of Congress barred the federal government from wiretapping. Nevertheless, they were wiretapping out the gazoo, to use a technical legal phrase. When Jackson became Attorney General, he banned the Justice Department and the FBI from wiretapping. Now, notice, he had mixed feelings about wiretapping. A, he knew it was unlawful. B, he thought wiretapping was very important in some cases, and he thought specifically about espionage and kidnapping cases. So when he banned wiretapping, he said, and Congress needs to amend the Communications Act to allow wiretapping in these specific limited situations. Now, President Roosevelt liked wiretapping, and he asked Jackson about it, and Jackson said, you can't do it. It is flat unlawful. You know, some people are angry about this wiretapping, but you can't do it. It's actually absolutely unlawful. And Jackson also said in private to the president, I will not authorize it unless you direct me to do so in writing. And that stopped it for a while. But J. Edgar Hoover loved wiretapping too, and he mounted a really thorough bureaucratic guerrilla warfare against Jackson, and essentially convinced the president to issue the written directive to Jackson. By the way, Jackson and Hoover did not like each other at all personally. Jackson later on told his friends he, quote, hated Hoover, and he wished he had fired him. Hoover didn't like him either. In fact, when Jackson died, Hoover leaked an embarrassing story about Jackson just to get at him, I guess. Well, the president ordered Jackson to commence wiretapping, okay? And Jackson said, okay, you're the president. I will do that. And the president told him that he, Jackson, had to supervise the wiretapping, and also directed him to limit it as much as possible to wiretapping of aliens. Notice the wiretapping episode fleshes out our understanding of what Jackson meant when he said he would support the president as much as he could. Well, he supported the president big time after he had told the president it was unlawful in the wiretapping situation. The wiretapping situation presents squarely moral and ethical issues of an attorney's decision to assist the president in illegal conduct. Notice I'm not talking about advice, right? Because it's clear his advice was proper. He said, Mr. President, it's illegal. I will not do it unless you give me a written order to do so. Rather, we're not talking about advice. We're talking about what an attorney might do to help the president to fulfill an illegal plan. By the way, there were some arguments that said wiretapping was okay, legal arguments that said wiretapping was okay at the time, but Jackson simply didn't believe it. He always believed, he never changed his mind, that when the Communications Act, no person shall wiretap, and the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, a person includes the federal government, that meant it was unlawful. Now I want to talk, and we have to be somewhat sophisticated about what the law is here. Do you see that what is moral or ethical and what is legal are two entirely different concepts? For instance, has anyone here ever done a rolling stop? It's illegal, flat illegal, isn't it? Would we say that we were immoral or unethical when we did a rolling stop? Of course not. So do you see that we do violate the law? The speed limit is 70, right? That means you can go 75, right? But if you go 80, you're violating the law. I'm not certain if you're on a long and lonely highway, you're acting unethically if you drive 80 miles an hour. Now, with that, the distinction between ethics and the law in mind, think back to the airport situation. Do you see that Jackson said, oh, it's a no harm, no foul situation? Didn't harm anyone. Congress didn't care. Do you see that was the equivalent in Jackson's mind of a rolling stop? Yeah, it was illegal, but no one cared. It was okay. In contrast, notice that with the wiretapping, it's a little different, right? In the wiretapping, Jackson clearly told the president what the law was. He couldn't do it. And then the president said, we're doing it for national security reasons, and ordered Jackson to comply, and Jackson did so. Do you see that involved intrusions upon fellow citizens' privacy? That's not a no harm, no foul situation. If the government wants to wiretap your phone, that's an intrusion on your privacy. And by the way, because the government consists of human beings, they can't always be right? They're going to be wiretapping people's phones who are innocent, basically. Even worse, everyone knew that Jackson had allowed wiretapping. For the next 2 or 3 decades, the federal government routinely violated the Communications Act, and when they were asked about it, they were saying, well, Jackson did it. It's sort of a WJD, right? What would Jackson do, right? Now, by the way, also think about this. So here is Jackson being complicit in harm to his fellow citizens. I view that as unethical and immoral, okay? I do. But notice, one of the greatest ethical thinkers once said, he that is without sin, let him throw the first stone at her, right? We all know when we review our lives that we have never lived up to our moral principles. We occasionally have not lived up to our moral principles. And that's one way to look at what Jackson did. Notice that doesn't mean that what he did was right, because it was flat wrong. In addition, Jackson dealt with his sense of guilt in helping wiretapping our citizens through a process of atonement. He tried to atone for his sins. What he did was he vigorously, for his entire attorney generalship, tried to get Congress to pass a statute allowing wiretap in certain specific situations with safeguards. It didn't work. What it did was it made everyone angry at Jackson in D.C. Those who wanted to wiretap without limits were angry that Jackson was proposing a statute with limits. Those who didn't like wiretapping were angry that Jackson was espousing a wiretapping statute. He said later on, "It was an extremely unpleasant experience and caused me a great many enemies." He said, "I was going down the middle of the road and being shot at from both sides." In a sense, do you see his guilt and a desire to atone for his sin? And it gave him the moral stamina to continue fighting for a wiretap statute, even though it was so unpleasant to him. This Congress never enacted a statute, by the way, and he was a year and a half into his attorney generalship, moved by President Roosevelt to the Supreme Court. The next issue, I don't know what, I guess, I think I might be running a little late, but let's talk about, I don't know, do you think, I'll exercise my judgment here. Let's talk about the destroyers for bases case. You know, in 1940, all of Western civilization was on the brink of utter disaster. The German Wehrmacht rolled through Europe, knocked France out of the war. Italy joined the war on Germany's side, and Britain stood alone. In Winston Churchill's words, Britain stood alone against Hitler's gospel of hatred, appetite, and domination. Britain was in dire straits, and they were expecting an invasion by the triumphant Nazis. And the only thing that stood between Britain and the Nazis was the Channel. And to defend the Channel, the British desperately needed destroyers. Battleships don't work well in the shallow waters of the Channel. And destroyers were in short supply. You know, when I was growing up, I read all these C.S. Forester, Horatio Hornblower novels. I loved those books, right? Well, Forester was a writer at this time in 1940. He wrote a short story in which he pointed out destroyers are, quote, worth their weight in gold. And so Churchill was constantly pleading to Roosevelt, please, please give us 50 old destroyers that we had in the Navy. They were still operational, but they weren't very good. And by the way, Congress learned about it, and Congress passed 2 statutes in the summer of 1940 designed to impede Roosevelt from selling the destroyers to the British. Congress wanted to keep them for our own Navy. Jackson advised the president that in one sense, the sale was illegal, was unlawful. The basic problem was that it was a major political issue. The United States was neutral at this time, and many, many Americans did not want to go to war in Europe. And they saw giving the destroyers to the British as a step towards war. Especially younger Americans in their early 20s most were adamantly opposed to sending destroyers to the British. My father was a college student in 1940, and he remembered the destroyers for bases deal, and he sincerely opposed it at the time as being very bad policy. President Roosevelt wanted to do it anyway, and so he consulted Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican candidate for president that year. He also consulted Charles McNary, who was Roosevelt's who was Willkie's vice presidential running mate, and who also was Republican minority leader of the Senate. And the senators and representatives told Roosevelt, it sounds okay, but, quote, for God's sake, don't put the question to Congress. Well, Roosevelt had the bit between his teeth. Jackson had explained to the president, it's illegal. You can't do it, because there was a technical statute, and plus Congress had passed 2 statutes designed to impede the sale. On a transatlantic telephone conversation with Winston Churchill, Churchill said, well, you need a new attorney general. And finally, in a telephone call with the Canadian Prime Minister, where Jackson was present, Roosevelt assured the Canadian Prime Minister that a way would be found around the legal difficulties, and if it was not found, a head, quote, will have to roll. That is, Jackson's head would have to roll, okay? Well, Jackson obliged the president by publishing an opinion which covered 4 parts. 3 were very well done. 1 part was just flat ridiculous. He said it's lawful to make this sale, but he never mentioned the statutes that said it was unlawful in his opinion. Notice that this is an example of Jackson advising one thing in private, you can't do it, Mr. President, and then saying something very different in public. That's a fairly common activity in government. Anytime you see a lawyer speaking in public to support the president's policy, you have to assume that the lawyer is not giving a legal opinion at all. The lawyer is just a political advocate. And by the way, this is not a Democratic Party principle. It's not a Republican Party principle. It's just the way it is. By the way, in the end, the destroyers for bases was a tempest in a teapot. Germany never invaded, and the destroyers were were relegated to backwaters of action. The only exception was in 1942, the British staged an attack on the giant dry dock in Saint-Nazaire, France. This dry dock was the only dry dock in Europe that could handle the large German battleships like the Bismarck or the Tirpitz. The British took one of the American destroyers, altered her to look like a German destroyer, loaded her with 4.5 tons of explosives, sailed her into Saint-Nazaire, rammed the dry dock, and completely demolished it in a massive explosion. By the way, there's a pretty good British movie about the particular destroyer that was used. It's called The Gift Horse, and it stars Trevor Howard, a wonderfully stiff upper-lipped old English actor. We probably may remember. Now I'm going to skip over something called the FBI Suicide Squad, okay? It's kind of interesting. the War Department wanted to create a unit in the FBI that would operate outside of the law to ferret out spies in the labor union, labor movements. And Jackson wrote Roosevelt a 3-page single-space memorandum saying it's legal, saying it's illegal, and then said it a third time. And then he advanced all sorts of policy reasons why it should not be done. And he ended it by saying, I very emphatically and very deeply oppose this scheme. The president, in the end, decided to go ahead and implement the scheme. By the way, then Jackson was moved to the Supreme Court. In a private conversation between the president and a Supreme Court justice, the president explained, yeah, I'm moving Jackson over because he does not have a good relationship with FBI Director Hoover. And in addition, Roosevelt explained certain men, that is Jackson, are excellent in peace times, but not just the right stuff for war times. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring us up to the present and give 2 modern examples of what was happening in Jackson's time, okay? The first example is the distinction between what you advise in private and what you then say in public. About 10 years ago, President Obama decided he wanted to kill an American citizen in the Middle East who was supporting Al-Qaeda, okay? So he asked for an opinion, and the Office of Legal Counsel wrote a 50-page opinion concluding that under many limitations, it was lawful, considering all the arguments pro and con, and the president decided to do it. Well, the Attorney General gave a speech in support of the decision to kill this fellow, I don't remember his name, to kill this fellow, but the Attorney General's speech suggested that there's no problem whatsoever. It's easy. It's a done deal. What's the problem? Do you see how the private advice and the public advice on that occasion was very different? Final and last episode, after 9/11, President Bush, too, decided we want to start torturing people to gain information about our enemies. And he asked for advice from the attorneys. The attorney says, not a problem. It's perfectly legal to torture people. Among other things, the attorneys advised, if it's a national security issue, the president is authorized by law, by constitutional law, to override acts of Congress, to ignore acts of Congress. Now, let's talk about this, and let me say, I firmly believe there's no such constitutional principle, okay? That's just me. But that's not the problem. The problem is that the attorneys who advised the president told him there's no problem. They never suggested that there might be a problem. Do you see that if the president is going to act unlawfully, his helpers, advisors, should let him know there might be a problem? That is the problem. You know, about 3.5 centuries ago, an English guy named Thomas Hobbes carefully studied the role of advisors. And one of his fundamental conclusions, and as soon as you hear it, you know, well, that's obviously true. That is, if you're advising someone, you've got to tell the person you're advising all the good and all the bad stuff, so the advisor can make a decision based upon an accurate picture of what's going on. Hobbes said, the office of a counselor, when action comes into deliberation, you know, it's kind of fancy talk, is to point out the consequences of the action in such manner that he that is counsel, for example, the president, may be truly and evidently informed. By the way, in a more folksy way, Jackson said, well, my job was to tell the president what his chances were and what his risk was. Do you see that if a legal advisor, the problem with the legal advice that Bush received was not that it was inaccurate, I think it was, but that there were serious problems with the analysis, specifically 2 Supreme Court cases that suggested, no, you can't torture. The advisors never told the president that there was any legal problem at all. They said it's no problema, right? And by the way, under the Constitution, the president is supposed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, you know what? If that's the president's job, sometimes presidents decide, because of exigent circumstances, to violate the law. That happens, right? But the president should know about the problem when the president decides to violate the law. That was the true problem with the advice that President Bush received. Hey, that's sort of my chatting. I would love to hear any questions from you all.